Good morning, friends. This past Sunday, we explored the immediate benefit of obeying the positive aspects of God's law. The benefit comes from the fact that we turn away from sin in response to God's negatively stated commands, and then we actively pursue Christ's righteousness in response to the positive aspect of those same commands. And this creates a scenario in which we are not just stopping a particular sin and then leaving a void where it used to be, rather, we're turning away from that sin and replacing it with righteousness. And that is key. Because if we leave that void where the sin used to be and we just leave it empty, it will be filled up by something else. And as Jesus taught in Luke 11, that something else will likely be far worse than the original sin. And I wanted to consider for a moment just what that is likely to look like, particularly in a religious setting. Because we mentioned that one natural scenario that could happen to anybody is that someone recognizes that smoking is not healthy. So they stop smoking. But to fill the void left behind by that habit, they start drinking. Or maybe it's that they start to overeat. They indulge something. And so they basically replace one unhealthy habit with a different unhealthy habit. And that's just a general example. But there's something else that is particularly likely to happen when it comes to folks who have a religious culture. When someone attempts to rid themselves of sin because of that culture, without then filling that void with the active and conscious pursuit of Christ's righteousness. And to give you an example of this, we go back to Luke chapter 18, verse 9, where we read the words of Jesus, or about Jesus. We read, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt." Then Jesus says, "Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all I get.'" And the parable continues. And we've gone through this parable a bunch of times in the last 6 months, but today we focus on it a bit differently, because today we're not so much concerned, at least not initially, with the comparison between the Pharisee and the tax collector, as we are with the simple disposition of the Pharisee himself. Because before Jesus even starts the parable, Luke tells us that he's teaching this against those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. And friends, I think that is the most likely sin that will fill that void when, because of religious reasons, people successfully stop sinning without at the same time submitting themselves to Christ. Because this is what the Pharisees did. They were fastidious about the external aspects of the law as well as the negative aspects of the law. There's a sense in which they did indeed stop sinning in many ways. But in their refusal to acknowledge both the internal and positive aspects of the law, they didn't replace that sin with actual God-honoring righteousness. And so what ended up replacing the sin they had successfully gotten rid of was a sense of self-righteousness based on their supposed ability to not sin. Just look at the Pharisee's prayer. He says, "I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." He's saying, I don't sin like that. I am successful at not sinning in those ways. But because the Pharisee does not recognize the actual righteousness of God, because he's not submitting himself to God in humility, he just replaces the sin he doesn't do with an even worse sin, the sin of self-righteousness. And why is this sin even worse than the other sins? Because this sin convinces the one indulging in it that they are in fact not sinning and therefore have no need of redemption. The self-righteous person has convinced themselves that they are righteous, and so they're blind to their actual sinful state before God. This means that the consequences of self-righteousness are so much more dire than otherwise, because this is where it is a benefit to compare the Pharisee with the tax collector, because the tax collector has engaged in the sins that the Pharisee hasn't. Now, we don't know that he was an adulterer, but certainly by dint of being a tax collector in that society, he had absolutely been an extortioner and been very unjust. But as bad as those things were, and they were absolutely sin, he hadn't replaced them with self-righteousness. So when he looked at himself, he was able to see the sins of extortion and injustice, and he was unconvicted by them. You see, the essence of this parable is that two sinful men went to pray in the temple. One of them could not see his own sin due to self-righteousness because that self-righteousness had blinded him to that sin. The other man was able to see his sin clearly because as the Lord convicted him of those sins, he responded in humble reliance upon the Lord, begging God for mercy, which is how we start down the road of following God's positive commands. So, do we see how following God's law on a surface level, simply in reliance upon ourselves to get rid of sin, how that is incredibly dangerous if we don't then turn to the Lord in a reliance on Him and beg Him to fill us with His righteousness instead? Because if that isn't what happens, then it is so very likely, again, particularly in a religious context, that we will feel far too good about our own ability to not sin, and so that first sin, whatever it might have been, as bad as it might have been, will simply be replaced with the even greater sin of self-righteousness. So let's guard ourselves from such a thing happening by hungering and thirsting for the righteousness of Christ and asking Him to work that righteousness in us, that real godliness would take the place of our former sin. To that end, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.